Well, thank you for that introduction, North Paul. I'm the South Paul.
What did I tell you?
We're suffering from bipolar disorder. But we're both engaged in apologetics. Pretty paltry. Are you a politician? Or okay. All right, I should probably get off of this very quickly. It could degenerate in a hurry, believe me. Well, it's great to be with you here in the Vancouver area. My wife and I, we actually came a little early so that we could enjoy some of your lovely Vancouver weather, which is now not with us, but we did have some lovely weather to go up to. Actually, my wife has relatives here in the Vancouver area, so it was very fun to visit with them. And then we went up to Whistler Mountain and really just enjoyed the beauty there and the drive there and back. And then the next day we walked all over Vancouver, probably put on, probably did maybe 10 kilometers or beyond, just walking all over the place. So we really got a nice taste of the city of Vancouver. And it's really great to be with you all here and have enjoyed the hospitality from our hosts who've been so gracious. And Andy, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here. And again, thanks to all of you volunteers who have done such a marvelous job in orchestrating this and keeping things going. So really appreciate all of your efforts. Well, I've appreciated the emphasis at this apologetics conference on the importance of being a winsome witness. We heard about that from J.P. Moreland yesterday, talking about the importance of apologetics as a ministry, that it's not just beating people up for Jesus, that we're engaged in ministry. And yes, we use arguments and logic and defenses and so forth, but in doing so, we are to be gracious representatives of Jesus Christ. I think of the Winston Churchill wasn't always so gracious. One time there was a woman by the name of Lady Astor who didn't like Churchill very much, and she told him, she said, "If you were my husband, I'd poison your coffee." And he said, "And if you were my wife, I would drink it." So you don't have to have those kinds of comebacks in apologetics. That's not exactly how we are to engage with others. But I've been asked to address the topic of, is God a moral monster? And you may have heard of Richard Dawkins. How many of you have heard of Richard Dawkins? Okay, probably the leading atheist, not sharp philosophically. Has done good work in terms of biology, but he's become, ever since September 11th, there have been some cranky atheists that have come out of the woodwork, and Richard Dawkins is one of them. And so he has written this book called The God Delusion, in which he mentions, for example, how the Israelites engaged in ethnic cleansing and that they were engaged in these bloodthirsty massacres and so forth. And what I thought I would do as I try to address these sorts of complaints and arguments raised by Richard Dawkins, one of the, quote, new atheists, I thought I would give a little bit of context. Andy asked me to give a little bit more of a backdrop here to some of the broader philosophical issues, because simply to jump in on some of these Old Testament ethical issues without having, I think, a broader context for the problem of evil, I think would be unfortunate. And so Andy asked me to address that. And so what I'd like to do is, first of all, talk about the issue of the problem of evil. Then secondly, look at a few general guidelines as we approach Old Testament ethical challenges. And then thirdly, and you have a handout on this too, hitting some of the bullet points on the very specific question of the Canaanites. When God says, don't allow, or Moses is saying, leave alive nothing that breathes. What does that mean? And so we'll explore that. Richard Dawkins, in his book, River Out of Eden, says this: If the universe were just electrons and selfish genes, meaningless tragedies are exactly what we should expect, along with equally meaningless good fortune. Such a universe would be neither evil nor good in intention. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So this is Richard Dawkins. This is our world, the universe in which we live. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. In fact, Richard Dawkins, who is always appealing to science, says science has no methods for deciding what is ethical. That is a matter for individuals and for society. Science cannot tell you, for example, whether abortion is wrong. So you can't address through science any ethical issue as to whether it's right or wrong. But this is very curious. Richard Dawkins then proceeds to blast Christians and any believers in God. He sees religion, in fact, he did a documentary on this, entitled The Root of All Evil. And what is the root of all evil? Religion. This is the root of all evil. Well, I thought the universe is at bottom neither good nor evil in intention, that there's nothing but blind, pitiless indifference in this universe. Where does he get this idea that religion is now evil? So what we see is really Richard Dawkins speaking out of both sides of his mouth. Speaking on the one hand, well, there's really no meaning or purpose, no good or evil. Science can't tell us whether what's good or evil. And then he's going on telling us, the scientist, about religion being evil. So we have a significant problem here. And what I'd like to address is the very fact that atheism, sometimes we hear the word naturalism, that is, nature is all that there is. This material universe is all that there is. And science is the only way, or perhaps the best way, for us to arrive at knowledge. You see, the problem is this. If we are simply the products of these physical forces beyond our control, then where does evil come from? I had the opportunity to ask Richard Dawkins this question. He came to Nova Southeastern University in Fort Lauderdale, about an hour away from where we live. And so he spoke on the fact of evolution. And before anyone could line up at the microphone during the Q&A time, I was there. I was zip right there. And I wanted to ask this question. And so I about the evil and moral standards and rationality and so forth. So my final question was this. I said, in your book, Professor Dawkins, River Out of Eden, you say that we are all dancing to the music of our DNA. I said, if that's the case, then that means that beliefs are being produced in us by material forces beyond our control. So on what basis then would you say that the naturalist is more rational than the theist, the one who believes in God, if those deterministic material forces have been pumped into us by these processes beyond our control? Well, Richard Dawkins said, well, I guess it's because science works. The British accent, and I guess people like to hear British accents and has more authority or something like that. But anyway, he went on to talk about political parties and so forth. And then he kind of came up with this clincher. He said, and besides, science flies rockets to the moon, but religion flies planes into buildings. And 2,000 people erupted, clapping, Richard Dawkins, this final decisive blow. But they didn't realize that he was Dawkins the issue. He didn't at all answer my question. You see, those terrorists, what were they doing? They were just dancing to the music of their DNA. Richard Dawkins, in answering my question, was just dancing to the music of his DNA. And as you heard last night from J.P. Moreland, you can have a true belief, but it could be totally by accident, and that doesn't qualify as knowledge. So Richard Dawkins and the rest of us, if we land on something true because of these processes that have been, these non-rational processes that have been creating these beliefs, we can't claim any greater rationality because we happen to be right, luckily. And so there is no greater rationality if this kind of a universe that Richard Dawkins exists. And so we are actually, if he is thinking that he is more rational, then he's, again, borrowing from another worldview in order to make sense out of the things that he takes for granted, including rationality. Another atheist philosopher, Patricia Churchland, not that Richard Dawkins was a philosopher, sorry about that. Another atheist, a philosopher, Patricia Churchland in San Diego. She said that we are simply biological beings and that truth takes a backseat to what she calls the 4 F's: fighting, feeding, fleeing, and reproducing. And she says that truth takes a back seat to this drive to survive and reproduce. So where then does evil come from in this kind of a universe? Evil simply cannot be explained in this sort of a setting of selfish genes and electrons, material forces, deterministic processes. Things just are the way that they are. You see, as J.P. Moreland alluded to this yesterday, I was thinking, oh no, he's going to steal my thunder. But he restrained himself and just briefly addressed a question, so I'm going to elaborate a little bit here. Evil assumes that things ought to be different, that there is a design plan that is in place. You see, evil is a departure from the way things ought to be. But if nature is all that there is no ought to be. There is no design plan. There is no preferred state of things from any sort of rational standard. This is just the way things are. This is just how things end up. But why is it then that atheists are railing against the existence of God on the basis of evil? What leg do they have to stand on? Well, this is the question that C.S. Lewis himself asked when he was an atheist. This is what he writes in his book, Mere Christianity. He said, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense." Is the problem of evil an issue? Well, certainly it is. But we have to ask the question, which worldview has the best resources to address the problem of evil? And when we look at atheism, when we look at what the critics are saying, and even launching their attacks against the God of Scripture, they themselves have no standard from which to argue, because if nature is all that there is, then there is no way things ought to be. And remember this too, this is not simply the case when it comes to Western atheistic philosophy. This is true of non-theistic Eastern religions as well. For example, you have within Hinduism and other Eastern religions this understanding of monism. That's not when I say good moaning to you. But monism is the idea that there is simply one pure, undifferentiated oneness of consciousness, what Hindus call Brahman, or God. And so in the Upanishads, for example, you have the Hindu scriptures, you will have mention of how the Atman, the soul, is Brahman, God. So Atman, the soul, is Brahman, or you put Atman and Brahman together, you get Batman. Just kidding. But there was a book by the author Arthur Koestler called The Lotus and the Robot. Or it could have been called perhaps Come Load Us Reason Together. But this, in this book, The Lotus and the Robot, Arthur Koestler goes to Tokyo to meet with a Zen Buddhist scholar. And it was at the International House of Tokyo, so IHOT rather than IHOP. And he was asking this Zen Buddhist scholar about the problem of evil. And what the Zen Buddhist scholar was asked was, what about Hitler and the gas chambers? And the Zen Buddhist scholar said this: because of his commitment to monism, that there is no differentiation of good or evil, right or wrong, true or false. He said about Hitler, that was very silly of him. And Arthur Koestler said, what, just silly and not evil? And the Zen Buddhist scholar said, evil is a Christian invention. And that good and evil exist only on a relative scale. So, of course, if that's the case, then one can't really call Hitler evil, or the things that he did, evil acts, and so forth. Now, do we want to go that way in addressing the problem of evil? Do you want to say that it's just an illusion, just some invention? Or do we want to take the Richard Dawkins view that there is at bottom no good or evil, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference? Does that make sense out of our human experience? Of course not. And what J.P. Moreland said yesterday about, there are just some things that are intuitively obvious. And one of them is the reality of evil in this world. If you don't think that certain acts are morally reprehensible, like torturing babies for fun or rape, then there is something seriously wrong with your viewpoint. You don't need an argument. You need help. In fact, I was at Purdue University in Indiana a couple of weeks ago, and I was speaking about this topic of ethics and naturalism. And there was one young man who stood up, and I said, there's one viewpoint that among naturalists where there's actually a book called The Natural History of Rape. An anthropologist and a biologist argue that rape can be biologically explained. That when a male cannot find a mate because of this subconscious drive to survive and reproduce, he forces himself upon a female. And so this young man who was asking me a question was, basically saying that there are no moral standards. I said, would you agree with that biologist and anthropologist who said that rape is, really, even though I don't advocate it, that it's really morally neutral, that can be biologically explained and so forth? And he said, yeah, I guess I would agree. And I said, ladies, watch out. If there is no real right or wrong, that is a very scary scenario. But it also is something that flies in the face of all that we know about our human experience, that there are some things that simply ought not to be done, that we have duties not to do those things. But in a material world, why think that we have duties to anything? Why think that we have moral obligations at all? Why think that there are things that ought to be different than the way that they are? So if you have to choose between theism and atheism, or some Eastern, pantheistic or monistic viewpoint, go with theism. It offers far greater resources for addressing the problem of evil. A personal creator making human beings in his image, that God is the standard of goodness. And within Christian theism, God stepping into our world, God confronting evil, dying naked on a cross to overthrow evil, so that one day we would experience life in a new heaven and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. That offers far greater resources for making sense of the problem of evil than what naturalism or other non-theistic worldviews have to offer. So I wanted to put that into context first before looking at some of the general responses to Old Testament ethical issues. So let me, having laid the groundwork for that, let me secondly go to just give some advice on navigating the Hebrew scriptures and some of the challenges that they offer. In the first place, it's important for us to remember that when God is dealing with Old Testament Israel, He is working with a people who are uniquely called. You may have heard the term theocracy. That is, God is the ruler of these people in a special way. And so the Israelites have made a covenant with God. God has initiated this covenant with them. He says, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And then the 10 Commandments are given, you shall have no other gods before me, and so forth. And the people agree. They say, what the Lord has commanded, we will do. And so in this situation, we have a group of people, a culture that is being created, and this is going to be preparatory for a new covenant that will come later. But it is with an ethnic group of people. It is in a particular plot of land. And that this is a unique situation in which God is working that is different from the way things are now. The people of God now are Jews and Gentiles who have put their trust in Christ, the new and true Israel. We are, as Old Testament Israel was, a kingdom and priests to our God. As in 1 Peter chapter 2 talks about, the very same things that were said about Old Testament Israel are now true of us as the church today, that we are God's people, Jews and Gentiles alike, that this is the mystery that has been revealed, hidden from in previous ages. And now through Jesus Christ, this has become a reality, that the blessing of Abraham has now gone to the nations, that the nations are now incorporated or included in the people of God. So we need to remember that God is dealing with a unique entity in the Old Testament times, that this is far different from what we are dealing with in the New Testament and beyond. And also, we shouldn't see what is going on in the Old Testament as some sort of a model for all the nations of the world. This was God's particular law given to these people for a particular time. Are there truths and principles that transcend these? Of course there are. But we see things falling off like kosher laws and circumcision and so forth, things that were part of the old order of things that have now given way to a new covenant and a new order of things. And so when, for example, but even in the Old Testament, when we see God judging other nations, God doesn't judge them because they haven't kept the law of Moses. God judges them for violating certain fundamental moral standards. For example, when you look at Amos chapters 1 and 2, these nations that are surrounding Israel, why are they judged? They are judged because they have done things like ripping open pregnant women to expand their borders. They have violated treaties. They have betrayed vulnerable exiles into the hands of their enemies. Those are the sorts of things that they're being judged for. And God says, I will send fire on these nations. Another principle to help guide us as we look at the Old Testament scriptures. Avoid this statement, please. I take the Bible literally. That is such a confusing, misleading statement. Don't use it. Well, what do you suggest in its place? Here we go. Read the Bible literarily. Because there's some things that should not be taken literally. When the trees of the field are clapping their hands, don't take that literally, please. The Bible is filled with different types of literature or genres in the scriptures. We have historical narrative, we have poetry, we have prophetic literature, we have apocalyptic literature. in Daniel, Ezekiel, and of course the center of the book of Revelation. We have Gospels, which are in the form of Greco-Roman biographies. We have epistles or letters that have been written. So there's a whole range of types of literature within the scriptures themselves. And so we have to be very careful about having a one-size-fits-all approach to interpretation. And this will be very relevant when we look at the Canaanite question. Let me just give you a little precursor here. In ancient Near Eastern war texts, excuse me, the lecture is starting to get a little dry here. What are you going to do? In ancient Near Eastern literature, commonly in war texts, you would read exaggeration or hyperbole similar to what you see in Joshua, where we left no survivor. We left alive nothing that breathed. Sometimes, however, in the ancient Near East, you could, military commander could have eked out a victory, but he'd say, "We left alive nothing that breathed." They basically made it. But then they'd use this exaggerated language. "We left alive nothing that breathed. No survivors left." Well, anyone reading that in the ancient Near East would not take that to be literally true. They would see that as kind of stock exaggeration, common in war texts, but it wasn't intended to mislead. This is just how things were. It's sort of like when you win a hockey game, and the Canucks really slaughtered their opponents. Would that were so, right? Yeah, that's just coming through all the way. And wish you guys well. I'm not a hockey fan myself, but pulling for the Canucks here for you guys. But in basketball or whatever, this is commonly used. We annihilated those guys. Well, no one takes that literally. Everyone understands that this is hyperbole or exaggeration. In fact, the very language that is being used of the Canaanites, leave alive nothing that breathes, or utterly destroy them. It's interesting that God uses that very term when he is going to bring judgment on the people of Judah. For example, in Jeremiah 25:9, God says, "I will completely destroy them." Same word that's used for the Canaanites. He's talking about the people of Judah. Through the Babylonians are going to invade, and they're going to take Judah, captive. Going to take some into exile, but most of the people will remain behind in the land of Judah. But God yet says, "I will utterly destroy them." He says, "I will make them an object of horror and scorn, and everlasting ruin." In fact, in Jeremiah 9:11, he says, "I will lay waste the towns of Judah so that no one can live there." Again, this is exaggeration. This is hyperbole. And that same term that is used for the Canaanites is also used of Judah. But again, we know that there were lots of people from Judah who survived. They were not utterly decimated. And it's interesting, too, that when you read in the book of Joshua, you'll see language, and again, I've given you some notes on this, but we'll just get there when we get there. But I mentioned that the very kind of language that is being used for the Canaanites is being used for the people of Judah, and we see that kind of exaggeration that is common in ancient Near East also being used in the scriptures. And we also read that when there is mention of no survivors, we'll often see on the next page in the scriptures, lots of survivors left. So for example, it looks like, Joshua is talking about they had rest on every side, all their enemies, wiped out, no survivors left. Well, then we read in Judges, which is literally connected to Joshua, and we see that there are Jebusites who could not be driven out. We see lots of people who are still in the land. In fact, even at the end of Joshua, he talks about the nations that remain among you to this day. So he is recognizing that there are lots of people still in the land. In chapter 11, the Anakites, the sons of Anak, were mentioned, that they were utterly wiped out. None left. Then we get to chapter 14, and Caleb says, boy, there are lots of Anakites left in the land, in the hill country. So he's going to go and they're going to do battle and so forth. Well, what's happening? It's interesting. I was on I did a radio debate with an atheist, or for the president of the London Humanist Society, Norman Bachrach, and you can find this on the internet. And Norman Bachrach and I, we were going back and forth on this. He said, if you say that you can't, take the Bible literally when it says we left alive nothing that breathes, then what can you take literally in the Bible? I said, well, why is it that you're taking only one side of the ledger literally, but you're totally ignoring all those survivors that were left? Lots of them. I said, so, it seems like you're not playing fair here. You're saying you need to take this literally, but you're ignoring all those survivors that remain. Lots of people. And I said, you can't have it both ways. And I said, if you take both literally, they're going to contradict each other. But I think if you understand what is going on in the ancient Near East, that they used exaggeration and hyperbole, it puts all of these things into proper perspective. So there is no inherent contradiction here. So we have to avoid the misleading statements that are often made about taking the Bible literally. And what we need to do is read the scriptures more carefully, not more superficially, but more carefully, attending to the text in greater detail, so that we'll actually see more clearly what is going on here. And so and just recognizing that there are different types of literature in the scriptures that demand different ways of interpreting. And let me just finish on this with just an example. Historical narrative, the principle for interpreting historical narrative is going to be pretty much diametrically opposed in methodology to how you interpret apocalyptic literature like Revelation 4 through the middle of chapter 22. You basically, in historical narrative, you assume that something is literal unless there are strong reasons for taking it figuratively. When you get to apocalyptic literature, you basically assume that something is symbolic unless there are strong reasons to take it literally. So again, you can't have a one-size-fits-all approach to interpreting Scripture. So beware of that line, do you take the Bible literally? That's not a fair question. Say, no, I take the Bible literarily, taking each genre or type of literature within Scripture on its own. And if you want to read a little bit more on this, I would encourage you to take a look at Douglas Stewart's and Gordon Fee's book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, which does just that. It goes through the types of literature, the genres of Scripture, and offers helpful guidelines for all of them. Another principle for understanding and coming to grips with the issues in the Old Testament is that what is or what is described is not necessarily what ought to be or what is prescribed. You'll see a lot of things that are simply done without regard to God's moral standards. Think of Lot and his daughters, in the incestuous relationship that there was. You think of of Abraham's lying about Sarah. You think about some of David's activities, and there's some of them very morally reprehensible. It's not as though the Bible is condoning those sorts of things, and we have to be careful. Just because those things are mentioned doesn't mean that that is actually an endorsement by God for those sorts of things that are being done. So be careful about moving from is to ought. Another principle to keep in mind is this: don't assume that we are seeing in the scriptures in the Old Testament scriptures, an ideal ethic for all times. Now we see at the very beginning in Genesis 1 and 2, we do see an ideal ethic. That is, we see all human beings, male and female, made in the image of God. That there is fundamental equality, that there is no basis for discriminating against or hating someone because he's of a different class, different skin color, different, from a different country. These are the sorts of things that are eliminated when we come to Genesis 1, 26 through 27, that God makes human beings in his image, in his likeness, and that this is a fundamental starting point for the rest of the scriptures. We see in chapter 2, monogamous marriage between a man and a woman, that this is the ideal, not polygamy, not adultery and so forth. For this cause, a man will leave his father and mother, will cleave to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is God's ideal. But once you leave that garden, things start to fall apart. Things are no longer ideal. Things are no longer pristine. And so you see human sin embedded in social structures. So you see things like patriarchy, a strong male-dominated society. But you also see, but when you come to the law of Moses, you also see God, meeting people where they are, permitting certain things because of the hardness of human hearts. This is what Jesus says in Matthew 19:8. He says that God permitted, for example, divorce because of the hardness of human hearts. And he also permits other things to take place, not because they're ideal, but more to regulate them, to control them, so that things don't get out of hand. And we can talk about the issue of, we'll talk about the issue of slavery or servitude in just a moment. But that's another area where we see that kind of regulation taking place. Another principle to keep in mind is this, that as you look at the Old Testament, the law of Moses, and you compare it to what is going on in other ancient Near Eastern law codes like Hammurabi and others, you see that there is a marked distinction. For one thing, in the law of Moses, you see persons having greater priority than property. Persons matter more than property. And this is a remarkable distinction between the scriptures and the rest of the ancient Near East. Property tends to come front and center in these other ancient Near Eastern law codes. But in the law of Moses, the covenant code begins with the treatment of servants as human beings and having fundamental rights. Another thing to keep in mind is that in other law codes, there were sometimes punishments meted out not to the perpetrator, but to a wife or children because of something done wrong. But you see that in the scriptures, the person who is the perpetrator is the one who is punished. So there's a basic accountability for one's own moral actions. You see, when it comes to servitude, a remarkable shift. And this is the kind of a standard reference Bible for biblical scholars is the Anchor Bible Dictionary. And the entry on slavery by Mohammed Dandamayev he says this. He says, "We have in the Bible the first appeals in world literature to treat slaves as human beings for their own sake and not just in the interests of their masters." Another Old Testament scholar, Christopher Wright, says this: "The slave was given human and legal rights unheard of in contemporary societies." And he goes on to write in his book, Old Testament Ethics and the People of God, he talks about this compassionate drift that you see in the scriptures. You see God's concern for even one's enemy. That you're to, if your enemy's ox comes wandering into your field, you're to bring it back to your enemy. You are to treat kindly those who are aliens, strangers, orphans, widows, the vulnerable in society. You are to look out for them. And God reminds them, you were once slaves in a foreign land. You were once slaves in the land of Egypt where you were oppressed. You came out of that furnace. And so when there are foreigners in your midst, you need to treat them kindly. It's interesting that there was this law in the Code of Hammurabi that said if a slave ran away and you were harboring him, you could be put to death for harboring that runaway slave. In Exodus and Deuteronomy, however, it says that if a slave runs away, he is not to be returned to his master. He is to be he should be allowed to settle in any of your cities in Israel. You're to look out for those who are oppressed. That is the tone, that is the tenor that we see in the Old Testament scriptures. Another thing to keep in mind is this. Some terms in the Old Testament should not be interpreted by modern connotations or usage. For example, when we come to slavery, the term is used in the scriptures in the Old Testament, but it is remarkably different from what we commonly associate with the modern slave trade and the antebellum slavery in the South. We think of the slaves being beaten mercilessly, having no rights, families being separated, and so forth. That is a far cry from the kind of regulations that we see in the Old Testament. If, for example, you knocked out the eye or gouged out the tooth of a servant, then he was to be let go. There's to be no physical abuse of one's servant, or we could even say live-in employee. This was what you see going on in Israel is indentured servitude. Indentured servitude. I know I was talking about a tooth just recently, but that's not what we mean by indentured. But we're talking about someone who is working for a limited period of time, and once he is done, then he is free and has all the rights of any free citizen. And in the same way, it's interesting, when you read in the Old Testament, servitude is voluntary. Now, yes, you could have enemies of Israel, and sometimes you'd have war, and you'd have to put people to work, carrying water or cutting wood and so forth. But but the servants within Israel, they would have rights. And it was only in times of great destitution, when they had no property, their harvest failed and so forth, that they would sell themselves. Talks about in Leviticus 25, if a man sells himself into servitude. Or it might say, if he parcels out his daughter. Some people think, wow, he's selling his daughter? Well, no, he's basically parceling out his family within a tribal land, within his clan, within his extended family even, for those who have a home and can help to take care of this family during this time of destitution. This is something that you did in desperate need. It wasn't the ideal, but it was something that you did in order to help your family survive. And once you paid off the debt, once you could get back on your feet, then the family was free to reassemble and so forth. So those are the sorts of things that we need to keep in mind as we are looking at interpreting the Old Testament and not imputing or attributing a certain meaning when we hear the term slavery, that is used in a modern connotation, and imposing that on what is going on in Israel. Another point to keep in mind, or another term that we often use, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. A lot of times we think that, there must be, you gouge out, the person gouges out my eye, well, he gets to have his eye gouged out and so forth. Well, that's not what it's saying. It's actually, whenever you read that phrase that is being used, there is a monetary compensation that is involved. It's not literal eyes and teeth here, but it's actually compensation, monetary compensation that is agreed upon, the judge decides upon it, and that is how these damages are addressed. One final principle to keep in mind here has to do with this idea. Sometimes you'll come against this criticism where the God of the Old Testament seems so mean and judging and so forth. And then you come to the New Testament, we have Jesus talking about loving your enemies and so forth. By the way, remember, he's quoting the Old Testament about loving enemies. He's actually referring back to loving enemies. Leviticus is referring to. So it's not as though this is some new concept that Jesus is coming up with. It is rooted, anchored in the law of Moses. So we have Jesus, yes, affirming those things, but remember, Jesus is one who, in the book of Revelation, comes as a judge. He comes to bring judgment on those who refuse to bend the knee, those who resist the grace of God in their lives. We see even in a parable that Jesus tells in Matthew 21, the parable of the vineyard, that these vine growers are being sent messengers. People are coming to check on these vine growers from this king, and what happens? They just get rid of one, they throw out another, and finally the king says, well, I'm going to send my son. Surely they will listen to him. Of course, this is talking about the nation of Israel and Jesus coming into the midst of Israel at that time. And then they say to this, the vine growers saw the son. It says, they said among themselves, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him and seize his inheritance. They took him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those vine growers? Well, the response is, from those who are listening, that says, they said to him, he will bring those wretches to a wretched end. That is what indeed happens. God brings his judgment on the people of Jerusalem in AD 70 through the Romans, signaling the end of Israel as the people of God and the new people of God, Jews and Gentiles who put their trust in Christ, being now the new Israel, that the kingdom has been taken from them, as Jesus said, and has been given to a nation producing the fruit of it, namely the followers of Jesus Christ. So keep in mind that the God of the Old Testament is one and the same as the God of the New Testament, that there is not this dichotomy. In fact, you read a lot more about God's love and kindness and compassion in the Old Testament than you do in the New Testament. In fact, Jesus ramps things up, and the Apostle Paul later on talking about we see the doctrine of hell more elaborated upon. This is something that is very serious, something that is very sobering, something that we don't see developed in the Old Testament, but we see more developed in the New Testament. Again, another reminder that God takes sin seriously. He is the cosmic authority who should be heeded. Now, I just realized I may be overshooting my time here. Do I go to 12?
You got 15 minutes.
Oh, praise the Lord. Thank you. All right, very good. That's good. So I like to say I felt like I was the Egyptian mummy, pressed for time. But I will try to wrap things up quickly. Don't you think so? Okay, all right. Otherwise, I could just babble on and just go nowhere. All right. Well, as we come now to the third portion of my talk, and you have a handout there. It's actually taken from an article that I wrote with a friend of mine, Matt Flanagan, published in the Christian Research Journal. And so this is just a pared down version of that I'm passing on to you in the handout. But let me just hit some of the high points of that essay, and just again some of the themes that are talked about in the book, Is God a Moral Monster? First, it's important for us to keep in mind that when God is bringing judgment on the Canaanites, when God says, leave alive nothing that breathes, that you are to make war on these cities and so forth, what is going on here? Well, first of all, this sort of command can only be carried out if it comes through divine revelation, that God has a specific purpose for it. If it's just attacking another people, that is problematic. But this is not what is happening. God is the one who is issuing this command. And what you need to keep in mind too is that it is an act of judgment on a morally degraded people. It is not as though they're just your kind, moral neighbors. These are people who are engaging in incest, in adultery. They have temple prostitution. They have, religiously sanctioned adultery. You have bestiality. You have all sorts of horrific things, child sacrifice you have going on. So God is saying that as Israel comes in, it is going to be a simultaneous setting up of the people for them to establish themselves in a land in order to prepare the way for the coming of a Redeemer for all peoples. But it is judgment that is now ripe. In fact, God tells Abraham in Genesis 15:16 that he is going to wait for the sin of the Amorites, one of the Canaanite peoples, to finally be completed. So 430 years go by before that actually takes place. So God is waiting patiently. This is something that is a long time in coming. So God is, so there's no ethnic hostility here. There is not it's not as though this is, quote, ethnic cleansing. For one thing, when we look at what's going on here archaeologically, we see that what Israel is engaging in is more like disabling raids rather than totally obliterating a land. They're disabling raids, and it's interesting that the cities like Jericho, Hazor, and others, these are cities that are not where civilians dwell. I mean, you might have a tavern keeper like Rahab, but these are places where you have the military and political rulers who are hunkered down there. This is the first line of defense before you get to the hill country. And so these are, not battles against non-combatants. They are battles against those who are fortified and ready for battle. And so these battles are actually, what the archaeologist Kenneth Kitchen calls disabling raids. In fact, God tells the people of Israel that you are going to inhabit houses and so forth that you have not built. And what would be the point of that, of just totally obliterating everything and then trying to set up shop and live in these places? Also, from archaeology, we know that this is the case, that there was a gradual infiltration. It was not some massive military assault, but we see a gradual infiltration of the land. And this is indeed what we see in the book of Judges in particular, in Judges 1 and 2. These Canaanites are entrenched there. They are hunkered down. There are lots of people who are in the land. And so what we have here is basically, for about a period of 200 years, there is this gradual assimilation that takes place. Yes, some military incursions are involved, but it's more a matter of process and infiltration. And this is borne out in the archaeological record as well as in the scriptures. So we see that there is something more going on here than just some sort of a massive assault. It's not ethnically motivated. In fact, remember Rahab, she is the one who is this tavern keeper, also a prostitute, who becomes part of the people of God. At the end of chapter 8 in Joshua, we see these Canaanite peoples, the Shechemites, who are actually participating in the reading of the law, and they are really listening to the word of God as Gentiles, as foreigners. And so they are, it seems like they are also being welcomed into the people of God as Canaanites, but yet open to receiving the word of the Lord. A couple of other things to keep in mind here. God tells Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 20, for example, the verse you have in your handout. He tells, the command is to leave alive nothing that breathes, to utterly destroy. And remember, I talked about how that word utterly destroy is also used of the people of Judah when God says he will utterly destroy, but it doesn't literally happen. There are lots of people from Judah who are left to go to Babylon, who are left to inhabit the land. But when this is done, it's interesting, when Joshua says it says Joshua carried out all that Moses commanded. Well, think about that. If Joshua carried out all that Moses commanded, and Moses said, utterly destroy, leave alive nothing that breathes, but yet there are lots of survivors left, did Moses mean that literally? Well, the answer is no. He understood it in this hyperbolic context rather than in this, in a literal sort of fashion. So Joshua was obedient to all that Moses commanded. We see that repeated in the book of Joshua. But yet we see that there are lots of survivors left. But Joshua is obedient to what Moses has commanded. In other words, this is exactly what we see in the rest of the ancient Near East, that this was hyperbole or exaggeration. Now, I've touched on the Amalekites from chapter 15 of 1 Samuel, as well as the Midianites, so I won't go into detail on that, but the same sorts of things apply. I'll just give you an example. In 1 Samuel 15, it looks like we have no Amalekites left except for King Agag, whom Samuel thrusts through. Saul had disobeyed God in his battle, that he was to leave alive nothing that breathes. Well, it seems like there are no Amalekites left, right? Well, chapters 29 and 30, we see that there are lots of Amalekites left. In fact, David is fighting against them. 400 of them end up escaping. So something more is going on here. So I'm just saying we have to be careful about overemphasizing certain themes and ignoring other ones, like lots of survivors being left and mentioned in the text. Another point to keep in mind is this. The emphasis in the scriptures when it comes to the Canaanites is far more highlighting, driving out, and dispossessing the Canaanite peoples. It is more interested in displacing them, in a sense, cutting them off from the land. You see, if you cut them off from the land, kind of push them out beyond the borders, what you've done is you have shown that their God, their worship, which is connected to the land, the God and the land are intimately connected, you end up breaking up that kind of theology. You end up throwing them into confusion about the powers of their own gods. In fact, the Canaanites should have known that the God of Israel was far more powerful because he had already demonstrated that in the land of Egypt and how he had triumphed over the gods of the Egyptians and led the Israelites out through the Red Sea. So you have, and so when Rahab talks to the spies, she is one who acknowledges that everybody knows about your God and how he brought you out of the land of Egypt and how God, the one true God, triumphed over their false gods. And so now when they're in the land, they are dispossessing or removing. And again, to dispossess or to drive out does not mean to kill. Adam and Eve, the same word that's used, they were driven out of the Garden of Eden. Cain was driven out. David was driven from the presence of Saul. All alive, death is not implied here. So these are some of the things that add a lot of interest and nuance to the whole discussion of the question of the Canaanites. It is clearly not ethnically motivated. In fact, we read elsewhere in the scriptures about how, for example, in Psalm 87, how God is interested in Zechariah 9 as well, where God is interested in redeeming all of the enemies of the people of Israel. We see from these passages also Isaiah 19, Assyria, Egypt, Babylon, the Philistines, the Jebusites, a Canaanite people. These are all going to be included in the people of God, that God in his redemptive plan has included all of these in with his own people. In fact, in Matthew 15, we see Jesus himself ministering to a Canaanite woman. We've come full circle here. God has a heart for those who are even Canaanites. It's not ethnically motivated. God is concerned about bringing it to an end, this moral and spiritual corruption that he sees in this land. But also God threatens the very same thing for the people of Israel when they give way to that kind of spiritual and moral corruption as well. In fact, the kind of judgments that you see the prophets bringing upon the people of Israel, you'd think that if they weren't Israelites themselves, it would sound like they were anti-Semitic or something. In Isaiah chapter 1 talking about, the people of Israel as being Sodom and Gomorrah. That's how they are being addressed. But no, it is because of the spiritual and moral corruption that has taken place that God utilizes that kind of terminology. So it's not as though there is ethnic hostility here that we're talking about when it comes to the Canaanites. In our day, when we have people who don't like the idea of judgment, when they don't like the idea of being confronted with sin, it's important for us to remind our challengers, our interlocutors, that this is a God who is a cosmic authority, that God makes certain demands upon us. As we read in The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, Aslan, this Jesus figure, he is good, but he is not safe. Jesus is good, but he is not safe. He is not safe even for his own people. We always find Jesus challenging. We find Jesus challenging his own disciples, reminding them of their sin, of their error, of their blindness. We can never become comfortable or complacent in our discipleship in the kingdom of God. We are always to be challenged, always to be seeking first, daily taking up our cross and following Christ. So as we look at the challenges, let me just, of the Canaanites, let me just say a few things with regard to, from a more philosophical point of view about some of these issues. Some people say, well, we know that it's wrong to, attack certain peoples, that it looks like kind of ethnic cleansing or, and that seems like what's going on here with the Canaanites. I would say, if there weren't some divine directive given by God through special revelation, then Israel should not have engaged in this kind of attack. Now, some people say, well, how can that be? How can God, or how can God command that sort of a thing? Well, again, we come to the issue of judgment. We come to the issue of kind of a serious crisis here, a moral and spiritual emergency. Now, Some people, this is a question that comes up in the literature in philosophy. Sometimes you'll have these ethical debates about, was it permissible for for bombs to be dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in civilian centers rather than, say, in military installations? Well, that is a question that is being debated. I mean, I myself would say that was not the right thing to do, but there are people who debate. They say, well, you have these what are called prima facie duties, ethically, that all things being equal, this is what you ought to do. But there are sometimes instances of, for example, international emergency where other measures are required to be taken. And in the literature, you will see people debating both sides of the issue, offering arguments for why it was morally permissible to do this, even though it was an exceptional situation to drop the bombs on civilian centers because of the protracted nature of the war and so forth. Now again, I'm not saying that because I'm taking sides here, but I'm saying that it's not necessarily a slam dunk to say that this kind of a command against the Canaanites could simply not be justified. There may be cases of, as I said, spiritual, international, moral emergency where judgment is required in this unique way. So, another point to keep in mind is, some people say, well, does this mean that God could just command anyone to do anything that he wanted, that there would be no moral distinction? Like J.P. Moreland was saying yesterday, God is deciding, well, let's torturing babies for fun, let's call that wrong. Well, that's not how it works. There are certain things, like torturing babies for fun or rape, that God would never command. But there are some cases where we might be challenged morally, where God might command something that might stretch us, that might be a hard thing for us to receive. But we also need to remember that we are not the final moral authorities, that we often find ourselves throughout our lifetimes adjusting our own moral understanding of things in light of new evidence, in light of a new moral awareness. Things start to become clearer, and things that we were maybe morally dogmatic about earlier on, we've kind of let go of and realized, I've had to change my view on this thing. So we have to be careful about insisting on the way that we see things is the way that things really are morally. For example, in our society, we might be more in tune with racism, but I'd say far more out of step with God's standards when it comes to sexuality. Our moral intuitions have been blunted in that regard, and so we need God's correcting influence in our lives. Those are a few things. I had more things to say, but I'm out of time. But I hope that these are some things that will be helpful for you as you process, again, what is probably the most difficult issue in Old Testament ethical concerns, namely the question of the Canaanites. So I wish we had time for Q&A here, but hopefully we'll be able to get to a number of the questions that you have tweeted. And so I look forward to answering some of those issues, and looking forward to hopefully interacting with some of you a little later on. Thanks very much. Blessings on you.